He bought a new apartment for his wife, but discovered that the keys to it were also with a stranger. Jake had always trusted his wife, Margarita. They had been together for 5 years, and it seemed like they had everything. A nice apartment, stable jobs, travel, romantic evenings. Jake was sure that all of this was the result of their shared efforts, and most importantly, trust in each other. He always put her first, working 2 jobs to support their family, so he could give her everything she dreamed of. She was his priority, and he believed he was hers too. But lately, something in his mind had started to change. They had started to drift apart. At first, it was little things. Margarita started staying late at work, and then on weekends, she would disappear, silently choosing her activities. At first, Jake didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just stress, routine, or even a need for personal space. But over time, his surprise began to turn into worry. She started frequently taking her phone with her into the bathroom or leaving it on the floor beside the bed at night, as if trying to hide what was happening on the screen. He got the feeling that whatever it was, she was trying to keep it from him. One evening, after a long workday, his gaze fell on Margarita's phone, which had been left on the floor by the bed. This wasn't her usual way. She always carried her phone with her, even when she went to the bathroom. Jake felt a strong urge to see what she was hiding. He didn't know why, but in that moment, his heart started to race. Maybe it was his need to understand what had happened, or maybe just an intuition that something was wrong. He slowly approached the phone, picked it up off the floor, and turned on the screen. Margarita wasn't home, and he had a few minutes. At first, everything seemed normal. A few messages from friends, photos from their last vacation. But then he saw a message that changed everything. On the screen was the name, Mark. He had heard that name before. Margarita had mentioned him a few times when talking to her friends, but it always seemed like such trivial and insignificant information. But this moment was different. The message that appeared was this: "I'll be waiting for you at 9. Don't forget the keys." Jake's heart stopped for a few seconds. He couldn't believe his eyes. Keys. The very keys to the new apartment he had just bought for Margarita recently. They were only supposed to be with her. He instantly had a question in his mind. Who was this person, and what did he have to do with his wife? What kind of meeting was this? How was Mark connected to his wife? Just this was enough to push all other thoughts to the background. All Jake wanted now was to know more. He kept replaying this moment over and over in his head, trying to figure out what was happening. Could this really be a mistake? Maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe this was just some friend. But then, why the keys? Jake couldn't ignore this. He felt a cold wave wash over him. The suspicion in his heart grew, and it was clear that he couldn't just brush off this message. He started thinking, how could he learn more about this Mark? Why was he meeting with his wife? What was this meeting at 9 o'clock, and why had Margarita not said anything about it? Could it really mean nothing, or was there something bigger behind it? All these questions wouldn't let him rest, and all he wanted now was answers. At first, Jake decided not to jump to conclusions. He wanted to give his wife a chance to explain if this was really just a misunderstanding. But with every passing minute, his suspicions grew stronger, and he couldn't make himself stop thinking about it. Jake stood with Margarita's phone in his hands, not believing what he was seeing. He read Mark's message again and again, trying to figure out if there was any other logic behind it. During the last glance, he noticed another message. It was late and short. "Everything will be okay. I'll wait until you're ready. Take the keys and come. You know what to do." These words wouldn't let him go. Keys again. Keys. They seemed to have great significance, and it didn't feel like just a meeting between friends. In that moment, Jake's heart raced. This wasn't just a message, it was something more. What was really going on between his wife and this man? Jake began nervously scanning the apartment. He couldn't let this go unanswered. The feeling that something was wrong was getting stronger, and every step he took reminded him that he was on the verge of something much bigger than just betrayal. He felt a chill run down his spine and decided he couldn't wait any longer. He had one chance to find out the truth, and he couldn't lose it. Jake decided to spend the night watching Margarita's behavior. He hoped the next night would give him the key to understanding what was going on. He carefully planned everything, deciding to come home late in the evening when she was supposed to be asleep. He gathered a few things and left her phone unnoticed. Before leaving, Jake wrote a note for his wife in case she would ask for an explanation in the morning. He decided that it was better not to tell her anything just yet, but his heart was beating so fast that it was hard to control his emotions. When Jake returned home, he saw Margarita coming out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel. Clearly, she hadn't noticed him. But what surprised him the most was that she was holding a small box wrapped in cloth. He couldn't help but notice how carefully she placed it on the table, making sure it didn't fall. Jake sat at the table, unable to contain his emotions. He knew he had to find out the truth. He decided not to ask her directly to avoid raising suspicion, but at the same time, he felt that Margarita was hiding something. The next day, Jake decided to revisit this mystery. He began searching for any possible evidence that might give him more information about this Mark. However, as he started going through old messages on Margarita's phone, he came across another strange discovery. A photo taken inside the restaurant where they had recently celebrated their anniversary. The photo, taken from inside the restaurant, only showed part of the table. On the other end, out of sight, there was no one visible, but Jake noticed how clearly the keys on the table stood out. They matched the dark metal set he had bought for their new home. His heart sank even further, and the questions he couldn't ignore became even more pressing. Unable to resist, Jake decided to find out more. He reached out to his old friends and colleagues to see if anyone had heard of Mark or knew who he was. Then, in an instant, he learned something he never expected. It turned out that Mark was not just a friend or colleague. He was a man with whom Margarita had worked before she met Jake. And as it turned out, their relationship was much closer than he could have imagined. Jake learned that, at one point, his wife had not only been in a relationship with him, but also had an ongoing, intimate connection with Mark that never ceased, even after she married him. All these new facts made him feel that his entire life, everything he had thought was real, had been built on lies. And now, with his heart breaking, he felt it was time for revenge. That's when he decided to act, and from that moment on, he didn't want to wait any longer. He wanted Margarita to understand. Her deception would not go unpunished. Jake remained in the shadows, watching every movement of his wife. The question that haunted his mind, for which he still had no answer, was, how far is she willing to go with her lies? He couldn't afford to make hasty conclusions, but the more he investigated, the more convinced he became that his suspicions were grounded in reality. The next day, After finding the photo from the restaurant, Jake decided to take action. He couldn't just sit and wait for the truth to reveal itself. He needed to find out what was really happening in their home and who his wife was spending so much time with. He decided to use Margarita's phone to investigate her daily activities in more detail. After checking all her messages, Jake once again stumbled upon an interesting detail. In one of the chats, he saw a message that raised his suspicions. Margarita had written that she would be free tomorrow and had planned a meeting with someone Jake didn't know. This man seems to mean something to her, he thought. At the same time, he became curious as to why Margarita had decided not to tell him who she was meeting, why these meetings always took place at night, and why she so often left him alone at home. At that moment, Jake decided that his next step was to learn more about this mysterious man who was constantly present in her life. Jake began following Margarita, trying to understand why she was always away from home. At first, he couldn't get a clear picture, but over time, observing from a distance, he noticed her habits. Every time she left the house, she always took her bag and a certain set of things, as if preparing to be away for a few hours. The feeling that she was going to meet someone never left him. One evening, when Jake was usually busy with work, Margarita, as always, left the house without saying where she was going. Jake felt that this could be his chance to learn more. He quietly followed her, keeping his distance, trying not to attract attention. Eventually, he saw her get into a car, where another person was already sitting. Jake couldn't make out his face through the dark glass, but his heart began to race. His suspicions were growing stronger, but he couldn't continue his surveillance. When he tried to get closer to the car, the man suddenly got out of the vehicle and, as it turned out, glanced in Jake's direction. His expression clearly indicated that he had noticed something, but he didn't rush to say anything. Jake began to feel nervous, realizing the situation was becoming dangerous. He immediately returned home, but this only intensified his suspicions. That evening, when Margarita returned home, Jake decided to take another step and take control of the situation. He decided that the next day he would personally check her bag. When she fell asleep, Jake quietly approached her bag. He was on the edge, ready to learn the truth, even if it meant uncovering the darkest secrets. He opened her bag and found what became the most significant piece of evidence in his favor: keys. They were the same keys he had bought for their new home, but it turned out they weren't only in his hands. This is no coincidence, Jake thought as he realized these keys didn't belong to him alone. He remembered moments when they had discussed that both of them should have keys to the house. But now, this was something entirely different. In his hands, he held keys that he had no connection to. The very same keys that had been mentioned in Margarita's phone message. This discovery led Jake to do a deeper investigation. He learned that Margarita had a friend, but what was important, this friend, according to him, also had access to those same keys. But the most surprising detail was that this man was one of her old acquaintances, with whom she had maintained ties even after she had met Jake. Jake decided he would find out more at any cost. He raised several important questions that he would have to answer for himself. And as he moved closer to the answers, he became increasingly convinced that his wife had been deceiving him for a long time. After several hours of investigation, he discovered that her meetings with this man were not limited to just a few random encounters, and their connection had lasted far longer than he had imagined. Jake couldn't just sit back, waiting for the truth to reveal itself. His suspicions were growing stronger, and now he felt it was crucial to know the truth, even if it was worse than he had imagined. He continued to observe Margarita, but this time with a new approach. He wasn't just waiting for her to return home. He started reaching out to friends and acquaintances to find out more about her recent meetings. One day, Jake received unexpected information from one of her old friends, Ben. Ben had been a former colleague of Margarita's, and while their relationship had always been friendly, he was surprised to learn that she was still in contact with her old friend, Mark. Ben added, "Mark never left Margarita, even after she got married. They still saw each other often, but you probably don't know that." This phrase was another signal for Jake. Someone who had been in her life before him was still playing an important role in her daily existence. Jake realized that he and Margarita were just characters in her convenient reality. She was hiding something much bigger than he could have imagined. Soon, Jake learned that Margarita and Mark didn't just meet for lunch or coffee on weekends. They spent evenings together when Jake was on business trips or at work. He was convinced their meetings were becoming more intense. He couldn't know exactly what was happening between them, but it was becoming more and more obvious. One time, when Jake decided to check her bag again, he found a small envelope hidden among her cosmetics. It was old, with yellowed paper, and there were no noticeable marks or writings on it. Jake thought it was just another promotional letter or note Margarita had kept, but when he opened it, his heart clenched sharply. The letter contained a short message: "I miss you. We'll meet tomorrow night, as always. I'm waiting for you." There was no name or location mentioned, but Jake understood. This was a letter for someone from her past. This confirmed his worst suspicions. Now he knew for sure. Margarita was meeting someone he knew nothing about, and this wasn't just a friend or acquaintance. It was something more. This revelation made Jake change his plans. Now, he didn't just want to find out who this man was. He was ready to meet him and ask him questions face to face. The night was dark when Jake went to the restaurant where, according to his information, Margarita and Mark often went. He planned to spend the night observing to find out the truth once and for all. He wasn't just watching from a distance. He was prepared to set the situation up to make it look natural. He arrived a few minutes late when he noticed the familiar black car pulling up to the restaurant. Jake immediately recognized her, Margarita. She got out of the car, and a few seconds later, Mark appeared. It was the same man who had been under suspicion for so long. However, what happened next surprised even Jake. He saw Margarita and Mark walking toward the restaurant, but instead of entering together, she paused for a few seconds in front of the door and turned back to him. Jake froze when he saw her slowly drape her arm over his shoulders, then kiss him on the cheek, while Mark watched from the distant stairs. It looked like a scene from a romantic comedy, but it seemed that this kiss had a very different undertone. After that evening, when Jake saw Margarita kissing Mark, his life suddenly changed. He couldn't return to his old routine. The more he learned, the more questions arose. That mysterious letter he found in her bag kept nagging at him. He decided to dig deeper into Margarita's past, even if it was uncomfortable. Jake began his investigation, going through documents he found in her personal belongings and reaching out to old acquaintances. And then, during a meeting with one of her old friends, Ben, he learned a shocking truth. Margarita, she was married before you, Jake, Ben said, his surprise shifting to sympathy. She lived in another city a few years ago, but when they divorced, She changed her name and started a new life. No one knew why they broke up. Jake heard these words, and his heart froze. She was married before and hadn't told him? So, that man, Mark, was probably not just an old friend. He was part of her invisible, hidden world, and Jake hadn't noticed any of it. Jake tried to learn more. He contacted several people who knew Margarita before they met. And then, during a conversation with Margarita's former neighbor, he discovered even more. She never told you what her name used to be, how she changed it after the divorce. She even left the city and left everything behind. It was so shocking that Jake couldn't believe his ears. The woman he loved and trusted had hidden an entire part of her life from him. She had been married, changed her name, and now, it seemed, had returned to old connections. On the day Jake received this information, he decided to confront Margarita and ask her directly. He returned home before she did. It was only after a few hours, as he sat down at the table, that he noticed one more thing. An old postcard left on the kitchen counter. The card was recent, and it had a written message addressed to someone. "I can't wait until we meet again. I will never forget the times we were together." There was no signature, only initials, M. Jake was stunned. Was this a new letter from Mark? Or was it another sign that something was seriously wrong? Jake decided to dig deeper. The next time Margarita came home, he asked her without hesitation, "Margarita, why didn't you tell me you were married before? And why did you change your name?" Margarita was initially shocked, and then her face changed to one of concern. She didn't answer immediately, but nervously started fiddling with her phone, as if looking for an excuse to avoid the conversation. This question became the moment when the wall between them started to crumble. Margarita looked as though she had been caught in despair. She sat down on the sofa and took a deep breath. "I know what you're feeling right now, and I understand why it hurts. But I told you, there was a difficult time in my past. It all has to do with when Mark and I were young and in love. But I can't just forget everything that happened. You were my salvation." Jake sat silently, not knowing how to respond. All these years, he had thought they were happy together. But if only he had known that it was all just part of her big secret. It made him feel like he was just another character in her life. That his relationship with her had only been part of her plan, not real love. Margarita closed her eyes, as if trying to find the right words, but her voice cracked as she continued, "I left Mark because he couldn't change, and that's why I started a new life. You were my new hope. But this man, Jake, he was always my past. I never really left him." Jake sat in silence, listening to this, but his heart felt empty and heavy. His emotions mixed with despair, pain, and anger. How could this happen? How did he not notice? It seemed that Margarita had an entirely different reality, one where he had no place, where everything was just part of her former life. And that was the most painful thing because Jake truly loved her, and she had kept him in the shadow of her past. Jake sat at the table, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his cup. He still couldn't believe what he had just learned. Margarita hadn't just had a romance with Mark before their marriage. She had been married to him. And more than that, she had lived with him in another city under a fake name. It was more than just betrayal. It was a whole hidden part of her life that he hadn't known. Seeing the expression on his face, Margarita felt her heart tighten with fear. She knew that there was no avoiding this moment. All her secrets, All the years she had hidden her truth were now becoming clear. I couldn't tell you about this, she said, her voice trembling. It was a past I left behind. I didn't want it to affect us. Jake didn't respond. He simply looked at her, trying to understand if there was anything in her words that could justify her actions. His mind was consumed by one thought. Why had she hidden this? Why didn't she tell him from the very beginning? What other parts of her life were still hidden from him? You don't understand, Margarita continued. This all happened before we met. I just wanted to start fresh. I thought it was the right decision. I didn't want the past to affect us. But Jake couldn't just accept that. His thoughts became clearer. This was more than just an unfortunate accident or misunderstanding. It turned out that everything had been planned. Margarita had a clear desire to leave her past behind. But why was Mark still in her life? And why hadn't she told him the truth? Jake decided to find out more. He was determined to delve into her past and uncover all her secrets. He went to the very city where Margarita had lived with Mark and decided to conduct his own investigation. With each new step, he began to understand how much deeper and more complicated everything was than he had ever imagined. It turned out that Margarita and Mark weren't just married. They worked together, had a joint business, and even tried to have a child. But it all ended when she left him, moving to another city to start a new life. Jake couldn't help but ask, could she really have so easily renounced Mark? In the city, he learned a lot. People who knew Margarita and Mark said their relationship had been very complicated, that she had constantly struggled with how he treated her. But that was a long time ago, and they didn't think it mattered anymore. Returning home, Jake heard from Margarita that she was ready to explain everything. But her words no longer held the same meaning for him. He began to realize that there was another part of her life that she had carefully hidden. Mark wasn't just her ex-husband. He was more than just a memory. It turned out that they were still in contact. This moment led Jake to feel that her past wasn't just hidden, it was also affecting their relationship. Margarita couldn't stop Jake when he went to meet people who knew more than she wanted them to. He returned home more and more convinced that he couldn't let this go without consequences. If she was ready to leave Mark, why were they still in contact? That was the question tormenting Jake, and he knew that in his mind, there was no room left for forgiveness or excuses. Jake felt the tension again. After everything he had learned about Margarita's past, it was hard to just move on. But her latest behavior only pushed him toward new suspicions. On Thursday evening, she again said she needed to spend time with a friend because of a tough day. Jake noticed that she had put on a new dress and the necklace he had given her for their anniversary. It seemed strange to him. Margarita rarely wore anything like that for casual meetings with friends. A few hours later, Jake received a message from his friend Logan. Jake, I think I saw Margarita. She got out of a car by the Regal Plaza Hotel. Was it really her? Is something wrong? Jake froze, feeling the adrenaline pulse through his veins. The Regal Plaza wasn't a place for friendly meetings. It was a luxury hotel known for its private meeting rooms and suites for businessmen and romantic couples. Are you sure it was her? Jake replied, even though he already knew the answer. Absolutely. She was with some guy, but I only saw his back. They went in through the main entrance. Jake decided to act. He quickly dressed and grabbed the small camera he had bought after his previous suspicions. He didn't want to jump to conclusions, but everything seemed too obvious. Jake was determined to learn the truth at any cost. Arriving at the hotel, Jake entered the lobby, where he was immediately struck by the atmosphere. Everything was in golden white tones, with crystal chandeliers and soft music playing. He felt like an outsider in this place, although he had once even planned to organize a romantic dinner for Margarita here. He approached the front desk, trying to hide his nervousness. "I'd like to rent a room. Is there anything available on the 5th floor?" The receptionist nodded, unaware of anything unusual. Jake had chosen that floor on purpose. According to Logan, that was where he had seen Margarita. He paid for the room, took the elevator up, and began to carefully survey the hallway. His gaze stopped at a door through which muffled laughter could be heard. Jake froze, recognizing Margarita's voice. "This can't be real," he thought, feeling his heart pound in his chest. Jake didn't rush to act. He decided to wait for the door to open. After a few minutes, his patience was rewarded. A man walked out of the room. Mark. Jake couldn't believe his eyes. There he was, the same Mark he had learned about just days ago. Now everything became clear. Margarita not only hid their marriage, but seemed to still be maintaining a relationship with him. Jake quickly took out his camera and started recording. His hands were shaking, but he kept the lens focused on Margarita, who followed Mark out of the room. She was smiling, and her face was happy at the very moment Jake was feeling only pain and disappointment. "Margarita," his voice was cold, like a blade. She froze, seeing him. Her eyes widened in shock. "Jake, what are you doing here?" "Interesting question," he replied, showing the camera. "I'm just making sure I know who I'm married to." Mark stepped back, trying to avoid the scene. "Listen, man, this isn't what you think." "Not what I think." Jake's voice trembled, but he kept his composure. "I think I've just seen everything I need to know." Without waiting for a response, Jake turned and walked back to his room. Margarita didn't dare follow him. She understood that at that moment, everything in her life could come crashing down. Jake locked himself in his room, reviewing the recording. He saved it on several devices, knowing that this evidence could become his most powerful weapon. He realized this was just the beginning of his plan. Now he had all the cards in his hands, and he could finish the game on his own terms. Jake returned home late at night, holding the recording on his phone as if it were the key to escaping an endless maze. His mind was racing with thoughts. He understood that simply destroying their relationship would be too easy. Margarita had deceived him, lied, and ruined his life for years. He needed to show her that her lies had consequences. But how? Jake sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee. On his laptop screen was Margarita's social media profile. He scrolled through her pictures, where everything looked perfect. Happy snapshots, smiles, the ideal married life she was showing to the world. It was all a lie. Suddenly, a message caught his attention. It was from an unknown person. "Jake, we need to talk. This concerns Margarita." His fingers froze over the keyboard. Who was this? And how did this man know about Margarita? Jake replied, "Who are you?" A few seconds later, the reply came, "I know about her past. You need to listen to me. I think you'll be surprised." Jake decided not to delay the meeting. The next day, he arranged to meet the stranger at a small cafe on the outskirts of the city. When he entered, His gaze immediately stopped on a middle-aged man with graying temples. His eyes seemed familiar, though Jake was sure he had never seen him before. "Jake?" The man raised his hand. "Yes, it's me. And you are?" "My name is Robert. I was once a close friend of Margarita's. Sit down. You'll find it interesting to listen." Jake sat down, feeling the tension growing inside him. "Why did you decide to contact me?" he asked. Robert took a breath and leaned closer. "Margarita is not who she claims to be. A few years ago, she lived in another city under a different name. She was married to my friend. His name was Adam. Their marriage ended horribly. She cheated on him, just like she did with you." Jake froze. This confirmed his worst suspicions. "But that's not all," Robert continued. "When Adam found out about her affair, he tried to expose her. But a few days later, they found him dead in his own home. The official cause was suicide, but I'm sure it wasn't an accident. After that, Margarita just disappeared." Jake felt his blood run cold. "You mean she was involved in this?" "I can't say for sure, but I'll put it this way. She knows more than she's letting on. And I think you should be careful." This information added another layer to Jake's plan. Now he knew that Margarita was not just a liar, but possibly dangerous. He returned home, reviewing the recording he had made at the hotel. An idea formed in his mind. He decided to use the recording, but not just to expose her. He needed to put Margarita in a situation where she would confess everything she had been hiding. Jake entered the bedroom, where Margarita was already asleep. He quietly placed the camera in the corner of the room, hiding it behind a decorative vase. The next morning, sitting at breakfast, he started a conversation. "Margarita, I'd like us to spend some time together. How do you feel about that?" She gave him a surprised look. "Together? That's unexpected, but okay. What do you suggest?" "How about dinner at the Regal Plaza Hotel? I heard their cuisine is excellent," he said, watching her reaction. Her hand froze on the coffee cup. "Regal Plaza? Why there?" "I just want to do something special. You love surprises, don't you?" Jake smiled, as if he suspected nothing. She nodded reluctantly, but her eyes betrayed her concern. In the evening, Jake prepared everything for a romantic dinner. He asked the manager to reserve a private room with a view of the city. Everything looked perfect, but Jake had a different goal. During dinner, he started a conversation about the past. "Margarita, I've never asked, but have you ever regretted your decisions in life? The people you've met?" She set her wine glass aside and forced a smile. "Everyone has their secrets, Jake. But the important thing is to move forward." "Secrets?" Jake leaned in closer. "Have you never been afraid they would come to the surface?" Her smile disappeared. "What are you talking about?" Jake took out his phone and played the recording from the hotel. Her face changed as she saw herself with Mark. "Jake, it's not what you think." "Then what is it? Explain to me what I'm seeing." His voice was cold. Her lips trembled, and finally, she said, "Okay, I'll tell you the truth. But please, listen to me." Jake nodded, though inside, his emotions were tearing him apart. "Mark is not just my ex-husband. He knows things that could ruin my life. He forced me to keep seeing him, otherwise, he would reveal the truth about me. And about Adam." "Adam?" "Yes, Adam. My first husband. What happened to him wasn't my fault. He just couldn't handle our breakup? Or he couldn't handle what you did, Jake interrupted sharply. Margarita fell silent, her eyes filling with tears. Jake didn't stop. Now he knew the truth was much darker than he had imagined. Jake had been sitting at his laptop in the kitchen for hours, replaying the footage from the camera. He kept rewinding the moment when Margarita kissed the stranger, anger mixed with a sense of betrayal. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. Jake wasn't expecting anyone and stiffened as he stood up. Approaching the door, he peered through the peephole. Outside stood Mark, the same Mark he had seen in his investigations. He didn't rush to open the door, but Mark knocked more insistently. "Jake, I know you're home. We need to talk. It's important." Mark's voice sounded urgent. Jake finally opened the door, but stood in the doorway, blocking the way inside. "What do you need?" he asked coldly. "Give me a few minutes. I know you saw the recording. You need to know the truth about Margarita." Mark looked exhausted, and tension was evident in his eyes. Jake let Mark inside but stayed on guard. Still not understanding why this man had come to him, he decided to listen. "She's dangerous, Jake. Much more dangerous than she seems," Mark began. "We were together for several years. She was my wife." These words made Jake freeze. Suddenly, all his suspicions flared up with renewed force. "You're lying. Why should I believe you?" Jake responded sharply. Mark leaned forward, showing his phone. On the screen appeared photos. Margarita in a wedding dress, standing next to Mark. The photos were dated several years earlier, before Jake had even met her. "This isn't all." Mark switched to a video. In the footage, Margarita was arguing with Mark in some expensive hotel. Her words were barely audible, but one thing was clear. She was accusing him of cheating, then smashing a vase against the wall. "She's a manipulator," Mark added. "I lost everything because of her. She made me take out loans and then disappeared, changing her name. I tried to find her to get my life back." Jake felt his blood rush to his head. His marriage, it seemed, was turning into a full-blown drama, and he was becoming a pawn in it. "You think I'll believe you?" Jake couldn't fully trust Mark. "Why show up now?" "Because she started using you." Mark raised his voice. "Do you think it's a coincidence that she found you? She doesn't change. She uses men as tools." Jake shook his head. His mind refused to accept such a picture. But then Mark pulled out another trump card. He took a document out of his bag, a printout confirming his marriage to Margarita, dated several years earlier. Jake felt the ground give way beneath him. "If this is true," Jake replied, barely holding back his anger, "then why didn't you just go to the police?" "Because she's very clever. I had no proof. But now I see she's continuing her game." Jake realized that this was more than just a betrayal. He wanted to expose his wife immediately, but decided to hold back. Now it wasn't just a personal conflict, but a challenge to her deceitful nature. "I have a recording. And this is just the beginning," Jake said. "A recording? What do you mean?" Mark asked, leaning forward with curiosity. Jake told him about his hidden camera and what he had managed to capture, the meeting between Margarita and the stranger. Mark looked shocked and intrigued. "We can work together. Expose her to everyone," Mark suggested. But Jake stopped him. "No, I'll do this my way. You already dragged me into this mess, but now I'm the one deciding what to do next." Late in the evening, Jake heard Margarita entering the house. Her light footsteps echoed down the hallway. He pretended to read the newspaper, but he could feel his anger boiling inside him. Margarita was calm, almost casual. "Hi, darling. How was your day?" she asked, taking off her coat. "Fine," Jake replied briefly, avoiding eye contact. He watched her as she casually put her things away and couldn't stop thinking about Mark's words. Did she really use him? Was her game still going on now? Margarita noticed the tension, but decided not to pursue the conversation. She went upstairs to the bedroom, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts. Jake pulled out his phone and watched the recording again. Now he knew he needed to act carefully, so he wouldn't lose the initiative. He began to think about how to use all the evidence against Margarita, but also not rush into exposing her. At that moment, he realized the most important thing was to figure out who else was playing this game. Mark might not be the only one from her past, and if that was the case, Jake wanted to gather them all together to finally put an end to it. Jake sat in the empty kitchen, holding a glass of wine. He wasn't drunk, but the alcohol was dulling his thoughts. Memories flooded his mind. Their first day together, her smile, how she held his hand and promised she would never cheat. Now those memories seemed like nothing more than a theatrical performance, scenes from a fake show where he was the main character, unaware that conspiracies were being plotted behind his back. It hurt him not just because she was deceitful or manipulative, but because it was her, the woman he trusted more than himself. Her deception wasn't a mistake or an accident. It was a conscious decision she made again and again. Every smile, every gesture of love now seemed like a cynical game to him. He felt this pain tearing him apart from the inside. Not because she was deceitful or manipulative, but because he loved her. Loved her so much that he was ready to close his eyes to the small things, not noticing the warning signs, and even now, part of his soul was still reaching for her, looking for any shred of justification. The next morning, Jake woke up with a clear intention. He could no longer afford to be weak. If she decided to play by her own rules, he had to create his own. His plan was complicated, but he knew that this was the only way he could end this story on his own terms. Jake called Mark. Though it was uncomfortable to drag him back into this chaos, he understood that Mark could help. They shared a common goal, exposing Margarita. "We're doing this tomorrow night," Jake said briefly. "Are you still in?" "Yes," Mark replied. "But are you sure this will work?" "She didn't leave us a choice. Be there on time." Jake rented a small private room at a restaurant where he and Margarita had celebrated their wedding anniversary a few years ago. This place held sentimental value for her, and he knew she wouldn't refuse to come. He created a story. He said he wanted to discuss their future and rebuild trust. However, in addition to Mark, Jake invited two more men who were also part of Margarita's life. He found them through social media and used his investigation to convince them to join the plan. They weren't just acquaintances, but also victims of her manipulation. One was a businessman from another city, and the other was a lawyer who had once even sued her. The evening came. Margarita entered the room, dressed in an elegant dress. She looked calm, even joyful. She probably thought Jake had decided to forget everything and start a new chapter in their lives. "You look beautiful," Jake said with a warm smile, but his eyes remained cold. "So do you, darling. I'm glad we're finally talking," she replied, sitting at the table. Their conversation began as usual. She mentioned their happy moments, pretending that everything could be fixed. But her tone changed when the door opened and Mark walked in. He sat across from Margarita, his gaze just as cold as Jake's. "What's this joke?" Margarita snapped, glancing at the man. "This isn't a joke," Jake replied. "We're here to talk about you, Margarita." In the next moment, two more men entered the room. They sat down at the table without saying a word, but their appearance spoke for itself. They knew who was sitting in front of them. Margarita began to panic. She tried to find an explanation, but Jake didn't give her a chance. "You know them all, don't you?" he asked, pointing to the men. "You've been playing with us, deceiving us, manipulating our feelings." She nervously laughed, trying to convince them that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But then Jake turned on the camera recording. The screen showed her kissing a stranger in their new apartment. The video was accompanied by her voice, where she referred to Jake as just a stepping stone to what she wanted. That was the moment her mask completely fell off. She realized she had lost control of the situation. "You thought you could hide this? That I would just break down and do nothing?" Jake continued, "You have no idea how long I've waited for this moment." Margarita tried to leave, but Mark blocked the door. "You destroyed my life," he said. "Now, I'll make sure everyone knows who you really are." Jake held his phone in his hands. He opened a live stream on social media and turned the camera on Margarita. "This is Margarita," he said into the camera. "The woman who betrayed every one of us, manipulated us, and ruined our lives." Margarita screamed, trying to grab the phone, but it was in vain. The men surrounded her, holding her in place. Jake stood by the projector, where video evidence of Margarita's betrayal flickered, and looked at the people around him. A feeling of triumph mixed with pain. The men around him, all of them had become victims of the same woman he had loved. Some looked angry, others shocked, but they all shared one common trait, a sense of humiliation. Margarita remained silent. Her face had lost its usual confident mask, but there was a cold fire in her eyes. Jake saw it, and it made him even angrier. How could she maintain this arrogance, even after everything had been revealed? "And here's the truth you've been hiding from me for years." Jake's voice was low, but with each word, it grew stronger. "My trust, my love. You turned it all to dust." "This," Margarita began, but she was interrupted by another voice. "Wait, Jake." Jake turned and saw Richard, one of the invited men. He stood up from his seat and now stood with his hands in his pockets. His tone was calm, but his eyes betrayed excitement. "I think you're going too far," Richard said. "What?" Jake initially couldn't believe his ears. "Look, I'm not saying she was right." Richard tilted his head slightly, looking at Margarita. "But this looks like a well-planned conspiracy. You invited us all here, showed these videos, to humiliate her. Are you really that innocent?" "Conspiracy?" Jake sneered. "Are you serious?" "Think about it, Jake," Richard continued, not paying attention to his sarcasm. "What if this isn't the whole truth? What if you just want to destroy her because you can't accept what you lost?" Margarita lifted her head, as if receiving new hope. "Richard," she whispered. "Shut up, Margarita." Jake interrupted her, but now his attention was focused on Richard. "What are you talking about?" We all saw the evidence here. Yeah, we saw it. Richard moved closer to Jake. But maybe you forgot to tell them something else? Like how you controlled her every step, how you checked her phone, installed cameras. This isn't what Jake started, but Richard cut him off. You drove her to this. I know, because she told me. A silence fell over the room, as if everyone collectively held their breath. Are you on her side? Jake clenched his fists, feeling his anger rise to his throat. Richard sighed and turned to the others. Listen to me, everyone. Marguerite is not perfect, that's clear. But look at it from another angle. Did any of you ever ask yourselves why she acts this way? Why did she lie? Because she's a manipulator, one of the men said. Or because someone cornered her? Richard shot back, looking at Jake. Jake suddenly understood. Richard wasn't just defending Margarita. There was a desperation in his voice that reminded him of his own. Tell the truth, Richard, Jake said, stepping closer to him. Were you one of her lovers? Richard paused for a second, but his eyes met Jake's. I was more than a lover, he replied quietly. I was the one who truly understood her. Understood? Jake started laughing, but it was laughter tinged with bitterness. And you stayed silent? All this time, you stayed silent, knowing what she was doing? Yeah, I stayed silent, Richard confessed, because I loved her. Those words hit like an explosion. Margarita jerked her head up, her eyes filled with mixed emotions. Fear, surprise, and maybe even guilt. You ruined everything, Richard, she whispered. You ruined everything yourself, he replied coldly. I stayed silent because I hoped you'd stop. But now... Richard pulled a flash drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. There's more evidence here than you could have gathered, Jake. Videos, photos, even messages. And not just with you. Jake grabbed the flash drive, his hands trembling. Why did you bring this? Because I want you to know the whole truth, Richard said. But I also want you to know, she's dangerous. Dangerous? Now Jake couldn't hide his surprise. You thought it was just betrayal? She broke more than just hearts, Jake. She ruined lives. Richard turned to Margarita, his voice cold. Do you remember Andrew? The man you left with debts, whose business collapsed? Or Paul, whom you forced to sell his house to fund your whims? Margaretha remained silent. Why didn't you say this earlier? Jake asked. Because I was afraid, Richard replied. But now I can't stay silent anymore. Jake looked at Margaretha, then at the flash drive in his hand. His mind was filled with doubts. He could no longer understand who was standing before him, the woman he loved or the monster he had failed to see for years. The next day, Jake sat in his office, staring intently at the computer screen. The flash drive that Richard had left turned out to be far more valuable than he had imagined. There were videos, photos, messages, and recordings of conversations that shed light on the extent of Margaretha's manipulations. She didn't just deceive men. She played with their feelings, exploited their weaknesses, and then ruthlessly discarded them. But now all of this was in Jake's hands, and he was determined to put a final end to this story. Jake rented an elegant hall in a prestigious hotel, inviting all the men who had been hurt by Margaretha. The invitation contained no details, only a mysterious promise of restoring justice. Jake knew that each of these men deserved their moment of truth, but above all, he wanted Margaretha to see the consequences of her actions. When the evening came, Margaretha, as usual, appeared last. She looked flawless, a black dress, expensive jewelry, a confident expression. She thought Jake was planning another attempt to justify her in front of the others. But as she entered the hall, she immediately felt that something was wrong. The atmosphere was tense, and the conversations died down when she stepped inside. On the large screen behind the stage, the title flashed, "The Truth About Margaretha." "What's this?" she asked, trying to remain calm. Jake approached the microphone and, looking her in the eye, said, "This is your last chance to see what's left after your games." The screen flickered to life. Videos from the flash drive began playing. One by one, men appeared, telling their stories about Margaretha. Her smile slowly faded. "This is a lie," she said, but her voice sounded unconvincing. Jake didn't react. He gave her a chance to speak, but instead, he pressed a button, and her messages appeared on the screen, where she openly confessed to her intentions to use each man. When the last recording ended, Jake moved closer to her. "Did you think your actions would go unpunished?" he said. "You're just pathetic," she replied, trying to hide the panic. "You're all the same." "Maybe," Jake said, "but now you'll be left all alone." The men sitting in the hall began to stand up one by one and leave the room. Each of them threw a look at her, a mix of anger, disappointment, and contempt. "You're all weak," Margaretha shouted, but her words were swallowed by the silence. After the last guest had left the hall, Jake looked at Margaretha one last time. "I loved you," he said quietly, "but you chose lies." He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the empty hall. Jake never saw Margaretha again. He later found out that her reputation was destroyed and all her financial schemes were exposed. She tried to move to another city, but her past followed her everywhere. For Jake, this moment marked the beginning of a new life. He no longer felt anger or pain. He knew he had done the right thing, and now he was ready to move on, discovering trust and love again, but with those who truly deserved it. What would you have done in Jake's place? Left everything in the past, or would you have restored justice to?